Okay, and I will start my slides. Okay, and so this is like the first lecture of the second part of the module. And so far, we have all focused on the front end, essentially the part that user would see either on their computer or on their phone later. And from now on, we're going to move on to the backend. So this is what all the code that you will write and run on the server. And usually the user will not interact with this part directly. And it is actually the front end that will send the request to the backend or the server. For example, send a request to retrieve information about the lessons, which will be saved in the database, or save the information about, say, a user transaction. For example, user booked some lessons, and that information will be saved onto the server. So this is what we're going to be talking about. And as I mentioned, maybe at the very beginning of the module, and for the backend, we're going to mostly using Mongodb, Node.js, and Express. So I would assume you already know something about MongoDB, so we're not going to cover in much details, but also I'm going to be recommending using online graphical user interface tools. So mostly creating, say, collections or JSON records in the database, mostly just clicking. You don't really need to do any programming much at all, so that should be fairly easy. And I assume you would have some knowledge about Node.js. And if you did second year module on web development, you would have some idea, but we'll still go through that anyway. And yeah, so actually the most of the time will be spent on Express, which I think will be new for most of you. And also, and just give you a little bit warning, it will be even more difficult compared to the first part. And based on the feedback that have from previous years, not in the sense in terms of the code, writing the code is difficult, and it's more just about you need to get to understand the way that Express works, which is a bit different than the kind of programming you have done so far. Okay, anyway, and so first I can actually start with some background today. I'm going to talk about development stacks and Node.js. As we said, Node.js is the server we're going to be using. But we're going to first talk about web development stacks. Okay, and so the web development stacks is all the components needed to run a web app, and which is very similar technology where you need to run, say, an app, a mobile app. And so this will including front end, and which we already covered. Vue is one of the kind of common examples. So Vue is one of the frameworks designed to develop the front end, as we said, run on the phone or on users and browser. And then also there is the backend. And so this is including the server, which is, let's say this is the entire backend, it's including the server, and usually run something like Node.js, but also it's including something called the middleware. In our case, will be the Express, which handles all the requests from the front end. And also there is a database, and which actually stores the data. In our case, it will be MongoDB. And also an important point here in this diagram is you can see the front end does not talk to the database directly. So some of you in the second year module, if I remember correctly, and the front end actually connect to the database directly. And in this case, it will talk to middleware first, and middleware will take care of in terms of saving or retrieving data from the database. Okay, and there's certain benefit of doing this. And we'll discuss this in more details a little bit later. And also, this is usually how actual app all works. And say for in the mobile phone app, if you run on your phone, it will not have, say, the IP address of your an online database and username password, and that just does not work. Okay, and so there's many different technologies you can use at different layers of the stack. or the part of the stack. The front end, you have different libraries or frameworks you can use. And same, you have different choices for the server or middleware. And finally, you have different databases you can use for the backend. So these are all these different acronyms comes in. Okay. And you have these stack, and which is start with something with A and P. And so the X can be a few different things for the front end, but the A stands for Apache, which is web server. The M stands for MySQL, which is a database, and the P stands for PHP, which is the language that you use to talk to MySQL. And then you can have the LAMP, XAMPP, MAMP, or WAMP, depends on the front end framework what you use. So the backend is the same. You use a server is Apache, and the database is MySQL, and PHP is the language. So you have the PHP on the front end, Apache server, and MySQL database. Okay, so this is probably close to what you use in the second year. Okay, and in our case, we are using a slightly different stack. We're going to be using MongoDB at the backend. Sorry, that's probably what you use in the second year. We're going to be using Node and Express for the middle part, not Apache or anything. And the front end, we're going to be using Vue. So there's other similar stacks to what we're going to cover. So they're all based on MongoDB, Express, and Node, and then plus something, which is the X here, which is usually a different flavor of the front-end framework. And so maybe the first one that becomes popular is called the min. So where the A stands for Angular, and there is the MERN. So the R here stands React. And finally is the Maven. I don't know exactly how to say this. And the V stands for Vue, which is what we cover. So this will be the framework we'll be using. Okay, and at least one of the advantages is here we're only using one language, which is JavaScript for all the parts. And so, for example, if you use PHP, a different language. Apache, again, is a different language from JavaScript. And then MySQL is using its own data format, which again, different from JavaScript. And whereas if you use Maven, so the front end will be using Vue, which is JavaScript, and Node.js and Express, both are JavaScript. And the MongoDB is really designed to support and JSON object. And so it's very friendly to JavaScript. So in the sense, that's an advantage. So you don't have to learn different languages to do this, to use the whole stack. Okay, as we said, we're gonna focus on the Maven stack. So we already kind of covered the Vue now, so we're not gonna cover more of that anymore. So we're gonna do the other three parts, the Mongo, the Express, and Node. So we're gonna start with the Node.js, and assume you already have some knowledge. And also we're not gonna be using Node.js that much because lots of the functions Node.js provides that we need also kind of simplified or made more user-friendly in Express. So you probably would end up using mostly Express functions and to do what needed besides the backend communication. Okay, and the Express itself is just another library, something similar to say Vue. And you can just load it by loading the express.js file, and it provides some functions. The difference is actually mostly designed to provide the function needed for a server on the backend, whereas Vue is mostly for front end, the display and say user input, support, etc. Okay, and so we'll briefly cover MongoDB, assuming you already learned something about it in the secondary module. The main difference here is we're going to be using the online version of MongoDB. And so you don't need to install MongoDB on your computer, which can cause some problems in terms of setting up different versions, the driver not working. what we do, we're going to using MongoDB, which is hosted online on a server called the Mongo Atlas. And the free version give you 500 megabytes of space, which is plenty. And for the coursework or for the module. So that will be the main database, our main difference. And also we're going to be mostly using some graphical interface to manage the MongoDB. So that should be quite easy as well. You don't need to write code at all. Okay, so we can also kind of using something called a Heroku, and which allows you to host your Node and Express code online. And in a sense, and Heroku is similar to GitHub Pages, and GitHub Pages allows you to host the front-end code, the Vue code online, but it can't support Node or Express code. So whereas Heroku can. And so once you, by the time you finish the second coursework, and you would have your front end on GitHub Pages, your server on Heroku, and your database on Atlas. So all three parts of your stack or layers of stack will be online. And so your apps will be able to run completely online without anything run on your laptop. So anybody should be able to use it. So that's actually usually how the real apps would work. Okay, and so that's about the kind of overview and the stacks, the components, different acronyms, and what we will cover. Now we're actually going to go to the Node.js part. Excuse me. Okay, so Node.js, or sometimes just called Node, and which is not very descriptive name, a generic name, and is a JavaScript and platform, and it can be used to run JavaScript. And so as you will be familiar by now, most of the time, JavaScript is run in a web browser, and either in, say, Chrome, or Firefox, or Edge, any of these browsers. Okay, but there's nothing says the JavaScript can only be run in a browser. And so this is where the Node.js comes in, and it allows JavaScript to run from a command line. And so we're going to see some examples later on. And you might also wondering why do you want to run JavaScript from command line? And for example, one of the useful the benefits is it allows it to work as a server for web apps. So the server is usually run on a remote computer somewhere on the internet, and they usually don't have a graphical interface as you would see in the browser window. So in those environments, Node will be a better option compared to the JavaScript have to run in a browser. Okay, and then using Node is actually quite straightforward. And if you have any experience with Python or Java, so in the command line, if you want to run the Python file, for example, the file is called myfile.py, you would write Python space for the file name, obviously assume, and the system know where the Python executable or interpreter is, and the myfile.py is either inside the current directory or on the path it can find, it will run. Okay, and similarly, if you want to run a Java file, what you can do, you can just say Java followed by your own code file name. In this code, myfile.java. Okay, and to run a JavaScript code, or more specifically Node code, if your code is called myappserver.js, the actual name doesn't matter, you just do node space myappserver.js and in the command line. Obviously, this means you need to have Node installed and it have the file actually there. But if it meets these requirements, it will actually run the whatever code you wrote and in the myappserver.js or myapp.js or what do you call it. And this is actually will be the main way of how we do that in the most of the module. Okay, and here the My App server will be the file contains the code for your backend server. For example, it can be responsible to respond to the different requests from front end, for example, retrieving lesson information or save a transaction to the database, etc., etc. Okay, and why do we use Node.js? For example, why not just using an Apache or some other databases or some other web servers? So first thing, because it's using JavaScript, so the same language as the front end. So most of you will be familiar, or at least have some knowledge about it now. So you don't have to learn a new language. It is actually quite fast. JavaScript is not language that's famous for speed, but from say a user perspective, say, and the difference between a Node server and a Apache server is almost negligible. For example, one takes 0.01 seconds and the other one takes 0.015 seconds. And the second one is still 50% slower, but from user perspective, you can't really tell at all. Other parts of the, say, the network time will take much longer and cover the difference, much more obvious. Okay, and also it is actually based on the JavaScript engine used in Google Chrome. Okay, so Google Chrome is open source. It has own JavaScript engine or interpreter. So basically, the part of the Google Chrome that runs the JavaScript code. So the people created the node, just take out that part and use it and make some little changes, and that becomes the node. So, and the JavaScript engine in Google Chrome, which is called the V8, and is quite fast compared to other JavaScript engines. And so that also implies the node itself is also quite fast. Okay, and then the other thing that make a node a little bit faster, or in some cases a lot faster, and is its ability to handle concurrency. Okay, so so this is the examples of handling concurrency. So concurrency means doing things in parallel. The opposite of concurrency is doing things in sequence. So this will be the doing things in sequence example. And so you have these 3 tasks, and you will do task 1 first. Even certain part of the task, for example, it does not require CPU. For example, it might send a request, then you had to wait for the data sent back, then request is sent back before it can further go to any further processing. So this part, it will be waiting. And then it might actually do something, and then you have to wait for another request or something else to be done before it can further go on. And so in a sequence, if you do this in sequence, you do the first task, and you only wait until it's completely finished before you start the second task, and go on and so on and so forth. So there's certain part which you actually not doing anything, but other tasks still cannot start. And because you have to wait for the entire task to complete before the next one can start. Actually, and if you look at here, and so the white one is your own code. That means it's running on your JavaScript engine or on your computer or phone. And these are the external things when you ask, say, send a request to the server to retrieve the list of products. And before you can get the response back, you can't really do anything. You have to wait. And so what you could do a little bit smarter is say, this is my first task. I run my code. Now I'm waiting for some external resources to send the data back. So while I'm waiting, I can actually start my second task. here. So instead of waiting till the first task completely finish, I can start my first task here. So I'm going to complete this part, and then my first task now get the data is needs to continue. So which would be fine. And then we can do my second task a little bit later. And if you're even smarter, you can mix in the task 3 as well. You can maybe starting the task 3 here, rather than say waiting the entire task to finish. And so if you just roughly look at this and say, this is how long it will take if you do everything in sequence. And this is say, if you be a bit smarter and take advantage of the time when one task is idling, not doing anything, and start on the future ones. And this will be the total time it takes to finish. And obviously it takes less overall time to complete the same 3 tasks. Okay, and so this becomes much more useful now because now many of the CPUs has multiple cores. That means you can do multiple things at the same time, one on each core. Okay, and to do this, and first you have to install Node, and it should be very straightforward, but usually it's always good just to check if you have that installed already, and if so, you don't need to do it again. And so to do this, you need to run a command line code, which it says node-v. So that means just checking the version of Node, and if you have it, and it should tell you what the version is. And if not, it will say command not found. That means you don't have Node yet, or you didn't set up it properly, so it cannot find the exe file or the executable files for the node. And so I already installed, so I'm going to just demonstrate now, so which hopefully should show you a version instead of say not found. So node-v. Okay, so it shows my node version is 15.8. Okay, so that means the actual version number is less important, and the most important one is it tells you Node is already installed, and it actually can find the files on the system. And most of the recent Node versions should be enough and for this module's coursework. Okay, and if you don't have one yet, maybe, I don't know if some of you would have that from last year, and just go to the Node.js website and download them. Okay, and so obviously this is a screenshot which showing a little bit older version, but usually you would have these 2 options, and you have this long LTS and current. So obviously, if you look at number, you know this is the latest one, and this is LTS stands for long-term support. So that means that's the version that will be keep updating for some time. And so this is usually useful for companies where they don't really want to update their software very often. So they will stick with the long-term support. And because a new version might have new features, but also that might break in some existing ones. It says LTS stands for long-term support. And for this module, either version is okay. Let me see what is the latest version now. Okay, so that's the latest version now. And the current one will be 17.1. The long-term support will be 16.13. And you can see the ones I had on my computer is already a little bit old now. It's only version 15. But any of this will be fine. Okay, and then so once I think you choose any of the version, it will ask you to download one file, and then you just run that file on your computer or install everything. And that should be it. Shouldn't be any further problems. And so in this installation, it also installs something called npm, stands for Node Package Manager. And it is actually very important. and potentially even more important than Node itself. Okay, so it's a tools for managing dependencies. Okay, and then so also can be used to install non-node packages. Okay. Okay, and so I'm gonna just try to explain a little bit in terms of managing dependencies. And for example, if you want to use an external library, in our case, for example, Express, and so you can just including Express in your code. But usually what happens is Express itself may depend on some other libraries, and these libraries might further just rely on some other libraries, and this can just go recursively, going on and on. And if you have to do this manually, it will be very time consuming. You have to find out, okay, if I want to express what other libraries it needs, let's say this is library 1 and 2. Okay, for these two libraries, what do they need? So library 1 will need library A, B, and C. Library 2 needs another library D and E, and it goes on and on. So that's very time consuming and difficult to maintain. And so what the NPM does is it will automatically find out all the libraries that's needed. For example, you say, I want to install Express, then it will install Express and all the libraries and their dependencies, in the sense, the libraries they need. So it will install everything you need to run Express, including those which you did not know they existed before. So that's also what happens later on. We'll see once you install one library, it actually downloads quite a few different other things, because these are other things need to run the libraries you need. Okay, yeah. And so on the Mac, you can also have the option to install the Node using something called Homebrew. And again, it's not a requirement, it's an option. I'm pretty sure on the Node page, it would give you a Mac installer as well, so that should work. Okay, and so the Homebrew itself is like another package manager, and it allows you to manage and help you manage and install different packages. And so let's say the NPM is designed to manage, or the package manager for all Node modules or Node libraries. And then the Brew or the Homebrew is designed for all Mac packages. So there can be any programming, right, wrote in any language, not just in JavaScript or Node. Okay, and so what you want to do is you first want to update itself and make sure the brew itself is in the latest version. And you say brew install the particular packaging you want to install. In this case, it's called Node. And if you already have Node installed, you can say brew upgrade Node, and then this will upgrade the existing Node installation. Okay, and if you didn't have Homebrew and you need to run this line of code on the command line, and then it will install the Homebrew on your computer. So this is just one of the options. And so for the Homebrew or the Brew, you can use that to install many other software for Mac. Okay, and so once you finish the installation, you should check that it's working fine. And so on the Mac, you use a terminal window and the command line on Windows, which is CMD. And you type in this command, which is similar to what we did before. Actually, this is exactly the same, and we already did Node-B, so which gives you the version of Node. And the important thing is you have some number shown there, and similarly you can say npm-v, which give you the version of Node package manager, and it's usually a different number. They are usually not the same. So you can see, and you should see both, not giving you error messages. And if it is, there's something wrong, and you either have to reinstall the node files, or you have to make sure they are available in the system path so you can find it. So the system know where to find the node and npm command. Okay, and so usually this probably should be the easiest part. And if you can see them, that means you have them properly installed and you can starting to use them. Okay. Okay, and so Node and itself come with a console, and actually it's very easy to start if you just type Node and your command line and you enter the Node console, and that's where you can actually type in any Node command, and it will just run directly. And I think the closest thing is probably you get that in Python. If you just type Python, you get a command line environment. You can just type in Python code and it will start to run. Okay, then you can type these commands. I type these, yeah, and Node command. And if you just type this in a normal command line, it will not work. Whereas if you type these and in a Node environment, it will actually starting to do something. Okay, let's just give it a try. So for example, if I do 1 + 1 now, and it will not recognize. And similarly, say if I say hello, plus world, it will not recognize as well. But if I type Node, you can see it's welcome to Node, and then you can see this now changed. And now if I type 1 + 1, it will +2, and or say hello plus world to a hello. So essentially, this is almost like you running the console and inside the developer tools, because actually in the backend it's exactly the same thing. So if you remember, if we open up and developer tools inside the browser, here we are using Chrome, you have a console, that's exactly the same here. So if I type 1 + 1, it gives you 2, and the hello plus world, it goes hello world. Maybe give it a space, 2 words. Actually, even the backend is got the same. So the backend running these JavaScript code is the same backend you're running the Node, as I said before, because the Node just take out the JavaScript engine from the Chrome browser and make it independent without the front end. I think it's Control D, yeah, to exit. And if we don't know, it will tell you. Just try a few different things. Okay, and essentially you have a JavaScript environment, and you can even define some variables, and then you can say do calculation on them, or just use it as a calculator, or you can even define the function and then use it later. So basically, any valid JavaScript code would run in this environment. Okay, and for example, there will be some differences and between what you can do in Node and the browser. So for example, require is a method available in Node, but not in Chrome. Okay, require is something, a special keyword, which allows you to load other JavaScript files. And in a browser, and you probably have to do this using HTML file, and it loads different JavaScript files. But for Node, you don't have this HTML file, so you have to find some other way to load other libraries you want to use in your Node code. Then you have to use require. Okay, and also the other thing which does not exist in Node is everything related to the front end. And so, for example, you cannot say alert a window because you don't have this window thing, and you can't do say document get edited by ID because it doesn't exist as a web page, and there's no HTML element to get. So anything related to a particular HTML element will not work in Node as well. Excuse me. Okay. And so besides using this kind of console environment, or you can also write your own code. And these code actually would just end with .js. So it has the same extension as normal JavaScript file. Actually, if you look at it, it's just standard JavaScript anyway, with some small variations, for example, the unique require command. And to do them, you just run node space followed by the name of your JavaScript file or Node.js file, for example. Okay, and then we can create something very simple, for example, and console.log would still work for the Node.js, and this is just output some single line and on the command line window. And to run it, you just run node followed by your JavaScript file, node file name, which will end just the same .js as before, and it will run and display something. Okay, so we're gonna do that now. Let me start the Visual Studio Code. Actually, yeah, maybe slightly overkill, but anyway. Let me open a new folder. This will be code. Okay, so I opened the new folder. Currently, it's completely empty. I'm gonna create a file. So I'm gonna just call it node-demo.js. So I'm gonna use that for my demo. And this will be very simple for now. I'm gonna just have this one line of command. Okay, and so I can just do console.log hello world. Okay, that's it. And so to run it, you need to run this command from the command line environment. So on Windows, you type CMD or use Command R or something, or Windows R. And you can do this inside of Visual Studio Code, and you can just use the built-in terminal. If I list my files, you can see, okay, my file is there. So I could just type in node-demo.js. You can see, okay, and so to run it and display one line of text. Or you can also run from here, you command the window, but here you have to make sure you are in the directory or including the file path. Because if I just do node-demo.js, it won't work. And because it tells me, and it can't find node-demo.js because that's not where it is. So actually, I have to go into code, and I think that's the one. Yeah, so this is a little bit long. Okay, so now I finally find the files I want to run. Then I can do the same, I say node, run the file. Okay, it now tells you generated the output, and then that's what we do. So usually, as you can see, it's easier to just do in the terminal window inside of Visual Studio Code, because it always will be in the same, start with the same directory where the file is. Okay, so that's not too exciting, but that's the thing. The actual file itself, the JavaScript files, can be very, very complex later on, but the way to start is always the same. You just say node, followed by the files you want to run. Okay, and then now we're going to introducing the concept of called the modules. And in a sense, a module is very similar to something like a library, which is some code people wrote before, and you want to reuse them in your code without having to write the same code again. Or you could write your own modules. That's maybe this and the same snippets of code that can be used at multiple places in your code, and you can create these. Okay, and then another way to use module is actually to break a very large JavaScript files or Node.js files into smaller ones. And the general rules is that if you have a very big file, it's not good. And from the coding perspective, because it's more difficult to understand and maintain. And for example, you're much more likely to introduce unintended errors when you make changes. So a general good practice would be to break it down into smaller files. And even better, you can make them more independent and reusable. Okay, and then if you do this, you break one big files into smaller files, and you have to find a way to actually load the smaller files into, say, one main file and use them all together. And so until very recently, JavaScript doesn't have a way to do this. There's no easy way in a JavaScript file to load another one. And this problem is solved now and use something called ES module. So that's natively supported by JavaScript, most of JavaScript engine. But that was not available when Node.js was first created. And so and at that time, if you have a website, you have to use a script tag to load some JS files. And as I said, for Node, you can't use script tag because there's no HTML file to include script tag. So, and it doesn't have this ES module thing by when it was first created. So instead, and it created own module systems called CommonJS. Okay, and which allows you to require building modules. So these are the ones that comes with Node. So it's already there. You can use them, and all you need to do is just load them, or you can use third-party modules. So these are ones people created and put them online, which you can download and use. And finally, you can even make your own ones and include that in your code. Okay, and Node has quite a few actually building modules. And you can see Node has been around for a long time. The version number is already go to 17 now. And each iteration is introduced some more new functions and more new modules. And so the basic ones, including, for example, an FS, and stands for file system. So allows you to access the files on a computer or on a server. And utility functions, so that's the generic names for something. And also it has URL modules, which allows you to pass the URL, which we're going to explain a little bit later on in terms of you can get, say, the values, like the parameters and their values from a string, which you need to pass the string to get those. Or at least you can say, do simple parsing, for example, just get the domain, and which is the straightw.google.com, that part of the URL, and the parse, and maybe say /maps/London/Hendon, etc. That's the parse. Okay, so to do this, and you're gonna just need to use the require URL, sorry, the require command. So that's the unique node command, and that used to load modules. And if this is internal module, in this case, it's called URL, and you just say require URL. And if it's external module, you have to including the full and URL or the link to that particular URL by starting with some websites, domain names, followed by file directory, followed by actual name. Okay, yeah, and it's works similar to import or include. Okay, so this is a common practice. You would require a module, and then you give it to a variable and with the same name as a module. So that's very common practice, and you will see this a lot later on. So later on, whenever you need to use this module, and you would use URL, but essentially that's a JavaScript variable, not actual the module itself. Okay, so here, so we first require the URL module and store that in a variable called URL, and then we can starting to use it. So we can say URL.parse. So that's a predefined function provided by the URL module, and it's going to pass this URL slightly this string as a URL, and then what you can do, and you can console log the result of the protocol, and which is this bit. You can recognize what is used to transfer data or files for this particular URL. So in this case will be HTTP, and sometimes can be HTTPS, and can be FTP, etc. And you can pass, get the host, which is give you the domain name, and you can give you the query. Actually, the query will be this part after the question mark. This is the part actually you can get the parameters and its values. Okay. Okay, again, let's just give this a quick go. So I can just add to the same Node.js file. I'm going to define a variable called the URL. I'm going to just require this internal package, a module, yeah. And because this comes with Node, I don't have to do anything else. So I don't have to set path or load the file beforehand. This will be completely fine. Now, once we import, we can start to use it. So HTTP, why it's get crossed out? Okay, just make up an folder /index.html question mark parameter equal to value. Okay, I'm gonna so this me fold. No, it's a wrap. Yeah, option Z. Okay, so here I'm asking using this module to do some parsing. Here the URL is something I just made up, and it's a bit different than the one in the example, but it should work as well. And then we can then display the results. First, I can say parse URL dot protocol. Okay, and hopefully it should return HTTPS this time. So I can just run the same thing again. Node. Actually, I might just comment out this part because I don't need that anymore. Okay, you can see now it's output to the protocol, and we can do the other one, which says console.log. In this case, I'll do parse URL.host, so which is supposed to give you the domain. And if I run this again, okay, and it shows the domain. Actually, should be straight W. And finally, I can do the same console.log and pass URL dot query. So that should be returned this bit from the code, and we can see, yeah. So this just give you an example of what you can do, and with a simple imported module called the URL. Yeah. Okay. So we already mentioned this before, and it's a quite common practice. When you require a module, you give it to a variable which uses exactly the same name, which is what we did before. And you don't have to. I mean, you can require this module and then give it a different name called as a URL module or anything you want. And obviously, I think very soon you'll get used to in terms of having the same name of the variable to refer to a module of the same name. Okay, and the next one I'm going to do a little bit is about actually running the modules not come with Node, created by someone else that you want to use. This is actually the more interesting part, because the modules actually come with Node itself is fairly basic, as we already see. You can pass URL, you can access files, not particularly interesting. And usually the more interesting ones is third-party modules. Okay, and these does not comes with Node, so you can't just do simple require. Before that, you actually have to get the files for that particular module. Okay, so this is where the npm comes in, as I mentioned before, and this allows you to install the files for your required module, but also to also download and install all the dependencies for the module you want. And all these information actually are stored in a file called the package.json. And package.json is actually a very important files for all Node projects. It will list all the modules has been included and some other important settings for your Node project. Okay. So, usually this will be automatically created for you and package.json. We can have a look here. No, we don't have that yet. Here we only have the node demo.js, which is one we just created. And once you start to using npm to install modules, external modules, and the package.json will be created for you. But it's just a JSON file, and you can manually create it as well. And so besides the dependencies or other modules, it also including information like the name of the project. You can define versions or even say who the author is if you want to. Okay, and this is probably the more important part of the dependencies is the third-party modules that need to run your code. Usually, if you don't have these modules installed, you will not be able to run the code. So they are important. Okay, and so this is one of the examples of JSON file. And so usually you need to either type this manually, you just create a new file called name it package.json and type these in. I think for Node, they also have some command line tools and which ask you some questions. They'll ask you to type in the name and you type in the name, author, etc. And it will generate the package.json for you. I mean, because it's not very difficult, so either one is fine. And most of these are optional. So we're going to focus on the dependency part, and which is including all the other modules that are needed to run your code. So obviously, currently we don't have any code yet, so we don't really rely on any other modules. But later on, for example, we're starting using Express, and the dependency would include Express because you need this Express, which essentially is a third-party Node module to run any of the Node Express code. Okay, yeah, so that's a little bit like recent things happened. I don't know how recent that is now. And Node is now owned by the GitHub, and GitHub is now owned by Microsoft. So Node is actually part of Microsoft now. Okay, and let's say we want to use a module called Mustache. So this is just one example. There's many, many modules and hundreds of thousands of modules. And that allows you to use double curly bracket syntax similar to Vue. So if you remember in the Vue, you can use this one, double curly brackets, to refer to a variable in the Vue. Actually, that Vue doesn't really invent that. It's actually borrowed that from some other early libraries. But obviously, you can't use Vue with Node because that's a front-end library. You can't use on server. Yeah, but let's say we want to use this double curly brackets, and one of the modules allow you to do this is called Mustache. And obviously, the first thing is you need to display Mustache. Oh, sorry, install Mustache before you can use it. And if you look at the code, the syntax is actually quite similar, and you define your own variables, one called the first, one called the last, and then you can refer them in the actual, say this case, in the text string. Then you can use double curly bracket, and if you say first in those, you refer to the first variable you defined later. And this last will be the second variable, the next variable defined. Okay, and to install Mustache, you run npm install, and then followed by the name of the package. And you used to need including --save, and to add this to your package.json file. But I think now it's by default would automatically done this for you. Okay. So if you want to install any other packages, it's exactly the same. You type npm install followed by your package name. And in this case, you actually don't need to give it a URL to say where online, and it will automatically find it for you because it has a central node package registry. So that's like the one place you can find all the packages. So it will npm will always go there, and it should find all the modules if it's available. Okay, and so we're going to do that now. I'm going to here very quickly. Oh, I'm slightly behind. And let's go here. Actually, let's go here. So you can do this inside here as well. So as I said, in the command line of the Visual Studio Code. And you can see currently I don't have anything yet. If I just type in npm install Mustache. Okay. And so you can see it's some message. Obviously, nothing errors. That means it's working. And it says added one packages, and also audit check 2 packages. It checks for vulnerability. Okay. And also it says, okay, we have a new version of NTM. It asked me to to update. But these are not the key things we care. Okay. And so now if we go back here, look at the files, you can see we have this package.json now. It's created for you. And it has dependencies. That's the packages just being installed. And also it tells you the version of the packages being installed. And so this is for information is also very important. And because sometimes a newer version or an older version is not compatible for your code. For example, your code might only run on Mustache version 4.2, or you only test with that. So say 3.2 or 5.1 might not work. So it's also important to including the version information. Okay, and the other things you would notice is this module as in this folder called node_module, which you can see here, and it's a little bit faded because by default, I think it's not visible. And this is actually where the code files for the modules is saved. So because the mustache itself would have its own files, so this will be saved under node_modules. And you can install other modules, and their actually module files will be all saved under here. Okay. And so as I said, usually you have to do this --save to save this information into package.json, but I think the more recent versions do this automatically, even without that flag. Okay, and so yeah. Okay, and so that's another thing just to quickly mention. And so later on, when you submit your coursework or you want to share your code, usually you share your package.json file, something like this, but you don't share your node module folder. And because all these different packages are freely available online, if you know I need Mustache version 4.2, other people can easily get it from the Node server, Node npm registry actually. So you don't have to copy all the files inside the Node module itself. And similar thing, when you submit your coursework, you only need to including the Node, the package.json file, and you don't including Node modules subdirectory. Actually, if you're including the subdirectory, it will make your submission files too big and you won't be able to submit. And similarly, when you create a GitHub repository, you want to exclude this node modules files folder from your GitHub repository, because again, the files there is publicly available, can be easily get from the node server. So we'll cover how to do that a little bit later on using
under testing. How about the lock package lock?
Yeah, and so that's another thing. We just don't really have time to, and it's something very similar information and about the mustache. Sorry, and it's something very similar to the package.file and has a bit more details about the packages you used. Yeah. Okay, and once you installed it, now you can actually require it in your code. So this is different from third-party modules. You first have to use npm to install the module before you can require, whereas the building ones you can require straight away without install anything. And then you can do some of these and starting to use this one. Okay, and I'm going to just run this quickly, and we are a little bit behind as usual. So I'm going to hide this. I'm going to comment these out. Okay, now because I'm installed, I can then require this. And this will be the results, will be mustache renderer using these two variables I defined. And then I can run in my console. Oops. Ah, no. Okay. Okay, and if I just do node, okay, let me clear this one first, so it'll be easier to see. And then I run node, the same node file, and here it will display some text, which is what meant to be done here. Okay, yeah, and you can also manually edit a package.json file, adding the packages you wanted to include. And for example, you can just open package.json and then you put in some other module name and version there, and you run npm install. Then the npm will go online and find those modules and install. And this is also, for example, when you clone a Node project or copy a Node project, it will not have the folders, the Node modules folders with all the files. So what you do first is you run npm install inside the project, and then it will install and download all the required modules, and then you can run the code. Okay, and then so this is how, if you want to create a package.json file, and a little bit easier rather than say create a JSON file completely manually, and you do npm init, and so that's the tools will ask you a few questions, and then based on your answer, it will create the package.json file for you. So for example, it will ask you what is the project name, what is the author, and all these are optional. And if you enter something, it will be included in the package.json. And so there's no difference between the files created this way and compared to the one you just manually created, say in the text editor. They are both just JSON files with the same information. Okay, and I think this is the last part of this lecture, is actually to creating a server with the HTTP module, so which is a built-in module provided by Node that can work or serve as a HTTP server. So it has a role similar to Apache in the stack. Okay, so we need to use the HTTP module, and the particular function we need to create server, it is called create server. Okay, so let me see. Maybe I'll go through the code first, just explain. Okay, so this line of code and just required HTTP module, and they give it to a variable of the same name. So this is called a request handler. So this is decides, okay, if someone send a request to the server, how do you respond? And usually, and depends on the request, you have different responses. But here, it doesn't. And it doesn't really matter what your request is, and you always log a message onto the console.log. Okay, so here is the subtle part you understand. Here, the log goes onto the console of the server. It's different from the console on the client side, which is front end. Say, for example, I'm running in my browser, try to visit this server. So this message will not display on my computer window or on my console. It only displays on the console of the server, which is the remote computer. What I will get is this. So it says response.end hello world. So I'm gonna receive this message back as the response, and that will display in my browser if I send a request. Okay, but actually, the real one handler will be more complex. You can try to parse the URL people send you, and then depending on the URL, you might have different responses. But always start with the easiest ones. Okay, and then running the server. This is the HTTP, which is this modules we imported or required before, and using the create server function, and you need to pass it the request handler, which we created here, so it can processing incoming request. Okay, and so finally you start the actual server, and you say server.listen 3000. So the 3000 is the network port that will be listening in the request. So anything that's not on port 3000 and will not be sent to this server and it will not respond. And so you can have many, many different ports for a server. And this will be much better covered in the network module. Okay, and so I kind of covered this part already. So I'm gonna just create this one now. Okay, again, I'm gonna still just using the same file. I'm gonna comment these out because I don't need them anymore. And our first request. And yeah, I have a little bit of time so I can type. And I'm gonna just close this button for now so I can have a little bit of space. I'm defining my request handler function, request and response. Okay, so the request and the response here are the two required variables. Exactly what the name is up to you. You can call them requests, and in many cases, people just short it for request. That's okay. But this will be the variable that you can actually get the request people send, usually including the URL people send, or maybe other things people pass on as well. And the response is what you're going to send back. Yeah, so I always just do say incoming request from okay, request.url. Okay, as I said, this one has to match this, and that's including all the information received from the server, and .url gives you the URL where the request comes from, and just display the request from. And then I'll just say response.end. So that's a shorthand of .end is a function which create a response and send it straight away. And I might see hello from the Node.js server. Okay, so give it slightly a different message. And I'll say server. Okay, so the HTTP here is this modules we required early on. I'm gonna create server. You need a request handler. And finally, I'm gonna just start the server by listening. Port in this case will be 3000. Okay, and to run this, you still do the same. You run the code and node followed by this name. Okay, your node file name. Okay, now you don't see anything, but actually it's already started running and listening to any incoming request. And because currently there's no incoming request, there's no display here yet. And if you go to a new tab here, okay, and because we know this server is running and running on my local host, so if I type in local host, and it will not give you anything because you have to including the correct port number. This says here is 3000, and it might be very small.
Sir,
yeah,
we can't see the screen. I am still seeing the code.
Can you see the browser at all?
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah. Now it's there.
Yeah, it's just the text is very small, so that's the part I couldn't change to make it bigger because it's on the URL part. And if I press enter, okay, so you can see there's a message coming back here now. And it says, hello from Node.js server. Okay, so that means this function is actually running now. And this part is send a response, which is received by the user. And this part actually is also working. And you can see now in the console here. So this is the equivalent of the console on the server. So if you see the console here, there's nothing. So you don't really see a message like this, incoming request from something, something. That only display on the server console, not your client console. There's nothing here. Client only gets the response. And the server side, it will say it's incoming request from /. So that just means local. And if it is actually from a remote, a different place, you would have a URL displayed here. And you have another one here is say by default, the Chrome will try to get a favicon icon for the web page. That's why you get this second request as well. Yeah, so that means the server is running as it should. And if you want to stop, I think you just press Control-C. Let's stop the server running. And now if I do this again in the browser, you will see, okay, server can't be reached because I stopped the server code here. Okay, yeah, so we talk about request handler. These two parameters, when you get any information about you received from the client side, this is the response that you will send back. You can change that too. Okay, and in terms of the information you can get in the request, so besides the URL, you can also get to say the type of the browser. Looking at the page, you can know whether it's say from a mobile phone or is a desktop version of Chrome, for example. Okay, and in terms of running the server, so we did this already. So we basically just run the node file, and in the command line, then it will run the server locally, and then you can visit it by typing localhost in your browser. And then depends on how you write the handler, you might get a slightly different message back. You should also get a message from your server console. Okay. Yeah, and so if you type a different URL, and then you would have different response in the server window. Sorry, in the server console. So basically, whatever URL user typed in, it will show up here. And all the HTTP localhost 3000 will be ignored and only start with a /. Okay, and that's it. And in terms of reading, this will be the chapter 2. And in the Express, in action, that's the textbook for the Express part. Actually, we skipped the first chapter for today. We start with the second chapter, which is on Node. And then next week, we're going to talk about the Express and including starting from the chapter 1 and the others. Okay.